The race that I'm about to talk to you about is a spec series. And immediately when you hear spec series, you tend to think less of it because, well, there's no manufacturer participation pretty much, so there's no real challenge on the engineering side when it comes to the best of a design, like in a IMSA racer or a Formula 1 car. There's less element to that. And yet, somehow, this spec series has remained not just one of the most iconic and well-known races in the world, but one of the 3 races of the Triple Crown of motorsports. I'm talking about the greatest spectacle in racing, the Indy 500. An Indianapolis businessman named Carl G. Fisher went to Europe in 1905 to help some of his friends in one of their auto races. And he realized 2 things while in Europe. 1, the US auto industry was not as high quality as the European industry. And 2, racing is quite fun. So when he returned to Indiana, he began dreaming of a 5-mile-long test track for auto development and auto racing. And he began turning that dream into a reality. He got some business partners to buy some farmland outside Indianapolis and began building an oval track. Now, his grand 5-mile oval shrunk to just 2.5 miles when he realized that grandstands were a thing. But other than that, things went pretty smoothly, which means the first race was held on June 5th, 1909, where 9 balloons lifted off and competed for who could fly the longest distance. Yep, that is the first recorded race at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. A balloon race. Yeah. Now, the first actual race was supposed to be held 2 months later with motorcycles, but the event was canceled due to poor track conditions. So, they tried car racing 5 days later, and that went even worse. The race did go ahead, and halfway through, Louis Chevrolet nearly went blind, and a driver and his mechanic died when their car flipped into a fence. And 2 days later, the grand finale of the weekend, a tire blowout sent 1 driver into the crowd, killing 2, along with himself and the co-driver. And the race was halted after another accident. They didn't cancel the race after that quadruple fatality. No. They canceled the race after another accident, and the governing body, the AAA, actually boycotted the track due to safety. Think about that. How dangerous is your track that 1909 safety standards said it was too unsafe? That's ridiculous. That must be the most dangerous thing on the planet, so Fisher decided to pave the track. But people didn't fully understand road paving at that time, so instead of concrete, they used bricks, earning his famous nickname, the Brickyard, which meant after a rocky start, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was hosting races as safely as 1900 standards could make them. By 1911, the organizers decided to focus on a single 500-mile race instead of several 200-mile races that were going on at the time. Now, what would they call the 500-mile race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway? The International 500-mile Sweepstakes Race. Obviously, what else would it be? The Indy 500 name wouldn't officially be used until the late 70s. And that 500-mile sweepstakes was a precedent setter as the greatest spectacle in motor racing. The first 1911 Indy 500 was won by Ray Harron, who decided to not use a riding mechanic in order to save weight. Everybody laughed at him since he wouldn't be able to see what is behind him, except he could, because he invented this thing called a rear-view mirror, and he easily won the race with an average speed of 75 miles an hour. From that point on, the racing just got better and better until a brief break when it was requisitioned by the Army for World War I. But after racing resumed, the 100-mile-an-hour average speed barrier fell as manufacturers like Peugeot and Fiat began developing purpose-built Indy cars. They also began establishing traditions that are still followed today, like singing Back Home Again in Indiana and drinking milk to celebrate the race win. And spurred on by this growing tradition and factory involvement, local privateers had to get creative. They began to use things like 8-cylinder engines and supercharged engines, which won in 1920 and 1924. But it was Fred Offenhauser's Offie engine that would change Indy forever, with dual overhead cams and a ridiculous 15-to-1 compression ratio. The Offie made 420 horsepower and was more powerful than anything else on the grid. But it was also cheap, reliable, and easy to implement in any design. Basically, it had all the benefits of the Cosworth DFV that would come out 40 years later. And it worked. Offie-powered cars won 27 times, including every single event between 1947 and 1964. That is 18 Indy 500 victories in a row. But all of that would have to wait until after World War II, because, racing was banned due to rationing, and IMS fell into disrepair before it was sold to 3-time Indy winner Wilbur Shaw in 1945, and he did a good job repairing it, and it was ready for 1946. And as the race's prestige grew, so did its international appeal, so much so that it was actually included in the Formula One Championship in 1950, which meant it had the first European entrance since Maserati in 1940. And Formula One brought the latest and greatest tech to Indy, most notably Cooper's mid-engine layouts. It was too underpowered compared to the Americans, but it showed the future. And Colin Chapman's mid-engined Lotus 38, driven by Jim Clark, gave the mid-engine design his first ever win in 1965, and Indy never looked back. Also brought over from F1 included ground effect aerodynamics with the 1980 Chaparral 2K and the Cosworth DFV from the Lola 78 in 1978. Now both of those were incredibly important. I mean, we still use ground effect in IndyCar today. But the Cosworth V8 was the big one that finally put an end to the Offenhauser monopoly, with Offie's last win at McLaren in 1976. So, that's the basic history. But we need to talk about a less glamorous side of the history. The split. You see, the organizing body CART owned pretty much all races in the IndyCar series except for the big one, the Indy 500, which was somehow still owned by the USAC. Now this had already caused contention between the two warring parties, and in 1994 a match lit the powder keg. And that match is called Penske, who worked with engine developer Ilmor and Mercedes to use a loophole in the USAC rules to build a pushrod 1,000 horsepower V8 that eviscerated the competition when it didn't crash or break down, to dominate the Indy 500 in 1994, and with that loophole, tensions exploded about lack of cooperation between the rival organizers, so the USAC, now named IRL, split off from CART in 1994 and kept the Indy 500 for themselves. No CART teams were allowed to race. Now, CART tried to rebound with the US 500 in 1996 at the Michigan International Speedway, which didn't work, and they declared bankruptcy in 2002, which means that 6 years later, in 2008, they were absorbed into IRL, ending the split after 13 years. And that was good timing because the 100th anniversary celebrations were beginning to arrive, and throwbacks were being had. In 2009, Indianapolis Motor Speedway celebrated the 100th anniversary of the track, and therefore the name was reverted back to the 93rd 500-mile sweepstakes for the first time in 30 years. And then in 2011, the event was celebrated as the 100th anniversary of the first Indy 500 race, not to be confused with the 2016 event, which was the 100th running of the Indy 500, because remember, there were a few years where they didn't race due to war. So this was the 100th running, not the 100th anniversary. And that 2016 event cemented its status as the oldest major motor race in the world. That one event completely sold out a crowd of over 350,000, setting a record for the largest crowd of any single sporting event in history. And they were in for quite a show. The race was incredibly close, with 3-time winner Julio Castroneves battling the rookie Alexander Rossi for the lead heading into the last 50 laps. But then Castroneves had a pit due to damage, and that meant Rossi was leading his teammate in second. But like many 500s, the winner would be decided by pit stop strategy. Rossi actually ended up being off strategy relative to the other drivers due to a pit lane mix-up, so his team opted for an ultra-risky 2-stop strategy while everybody else had to take 3. And even worse for Rossi, a yellow flag sent everybody into the pits, but Rossi's 2 stops were already done. So he had the option of either staying out with a slim chance of victory, or go into the pits and lose any chance of victory. They chose the former. But that meant he was dangerously low on fuel. The usual stint between stops is about 70 miles, and Rossi had to do 90. So the team called in a favor. Townsend Bell, one of his teammates already out of running for the win, pulled in front of Rossi and gave him a desperately needed fuel-saving tow. But even still, the math showed Rossi running out at lap 199. But with his other teammate bearing down on him, he entered conservatively, lap 200, coasting through every corner before using the last fumes in his fuel line for a full throttle burst down the back straightaway. His engine actually spluttered quiet heading into the fourth corner, and he held in the clutch, coasting across the line, winning his rookie Indy 500 by just 4.5 seconds before being towed into the pit lane. And races would only be more dramatic from there, with both 2019 and 2021 both having lead changes on the penultimate lap, with Helio Castroneves winning the 2021 event, his fourth Indy 500, being just the fourth person in history to do so. But there is one club that nobody else has joined, the Triple Crown. The Triple Crown of Motorsport is unofficially awarded to any driver who wins the Monaco Grand Prix, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Indy 500. And so far, only one driver's done it. Graham Hill won Indy in 1966, Le Mans in 1972, and Monaco 5 times, and the Formula 1 Championship. He was covered on that last one. He definitely double-checked his bases on that one. But he's the only person to ever do it. Even legends like Montoya, Alonso, Foyt, and McLaren have only ever been able to win 2 out of the 3. And Alonso is the last person to have contested these events, last competing in the 500 in 2019. So, that is the total history from 1909 to 2021. But how does it work now? What are the current operations like? Well, like most modern racing series, safety is a top priority at Indianapolis. Over the last 112 years, 73 people have died during Indy 500 weekends, including an explosive crash in 1964 killing 2 drivers, and a terrible snowball effect in 1973, which also claimed the lives of 2 drivers and a teammate running down the pits. But each accident has led to more and more rigorous safety protocols, including the first use of a safer barrier on a circuit. And after the safer barriers were installed, Indianapolis hasn't seen a fatality since 2003. And the cars are a lot safer too. Just look at the dramatic crash in 2017, which saw one car explode in half, while another car used that exploding one as a ramp, launching itself into the air before landing upside down on the edge of a barrier. And yet both drivers walked away unharmed. So as safety improved, how does the race actually work? Well, first things first, in 2020, Roger Penske bought both Indianapolis Motor Speedway and IndyCar, so he became the governing body of everything to do with American open-wheeled racing. And as for the weekends themselves, well, it's a lot more complicated than you would think for a spec series, because it is a spec series. They all use the same dollar chassis, and they all have the same engine specs. The upcoming 2024 cars all use a 2.4-liter turbocharged V6, with a hybrid system making 800 horsepower. And each team has 2 of these cars per driver for the weekend, a race car and a spare car. Although, depending on which one is faster, you are allowed to use either one. There's no rule that a spare car has to be purely for spare. It can be the one you use at the Indy 500 if it is a faster chassis. But first, if you want to get to the Indy 500 to see which one is faster, you gotta go through qualifying, which is much longer than IMSA or Formula 1. It takes multiple days, specifically 2 days. Saturday permits any driver to go for a qualifying time across a 4-lap distance. That's right, it's not just a one-and-done thing. You have to average a maximum speed across 4 laps. Those fastest 9 drivers go to a shootout on Sunday to determine the order of the top 9. Meanwhile, the rest of the field, between 10th and 30th on the grid, are safe. They only do Saturday qualifying, and then they just sit out Sunday, relaxing in their RVs, I don't know. The bottom 3, though, are nicknamed the Bubble, because there's only 33 slots on the grid, which means they also have to go on Sunday to re-qualify. if you're 31st and below. But if you score less than 33rd on the grid, well, you don't get to race at all. It is this system that led to McLaren and Alonso failing to qualify in dramatic fashion in 2020, when the cash-strapped Juncos racing team beat Alonso by just 0.0129 seconds. And that really sums up Indianapolis quite well. Even the qualifying sessions are the greatest spectacle in racing. They didn't earn that nickname for nothing. Whether it be the incredible technology and engineering that goes into these safety systems to allow these spectacular crashes to remain fatality-free, or the penultimate lap overtakes for the lead. I mean, there were over 60 overtakes for position and multiple Indy 500s, which I'm pretty sure is more than most F1 seasons. Everyone thinks it's just going in circles. How can it be interesting? It's a fantastic sport. It's one of the few races I always watch every single year. It truly is the greatest spectacle in racing, and I don't think any other racing series is going to take that crown anytime soon.